Hello, and welcome back to the Sociology of Hip-Hop. I hope that you had a restful reading week, and I hope that you've made some progress on assignment number 1, which is going to be due at the end of this week. Today we're going to be moving into a new concept, which will underpin the analysis that you're going to do in assignment number 2. So to kind of sum up where we've been so far in this course, we've covered the history of early hip-hop and its commercial ascendancy. You've gotten some practice with content analysis methods, so you've seen how sociologists have employed this social research method, and you've gotten some practice using it yourself in assignment number 1. For assignment number 2, it's going to be pretty much the same sort of analytical process. It's still going to be a content analysis, although you'll be selecting your own songs and focusing on authenticity. So again, we are moving towards authenticity today, but we've already covered big picture concepts like black noise and genre forms. So today we're going to be covering the kind of last big picture concept that we're going to be using throughout this class. So other concepts obviously will be introduced in the later weeks, but this course is organized around a few main sociological concepts, especially ones that are used in the sociology of culture approach. Like black noise, that's Trisha Rose's concept, and she's more of a hip-hop scholar. Although the concept of like genre forms, that's a more sociological concept. And today, when we're talking about authenticity, we're using that concept in the way that sociologists have used it. After today's lecture, we're going to go into various social research methods that social researchers have used to study hip-hop. So as we go through the following weeks, so week 5, 6, 7, and 8, think about which social research methods the authors are using, and go further than that and think about the strengths and weaknesses of the different social research methods that they're employing for understanding hip-hop. But that's for the future. For today, we're going to be talking about authenticity. As you watch the lecture and make notes today, think about the ways that authors have studied authenticity and ask yourself what kind of questions you would like to explore in terms of authenticity in your content analysis. What artists kind of come to mind when we're talking about authenticity? Do they fit neatly into the way that did they use these kind of approaches to claiming authenticity that we talk about today, or not? Are they doing something else? That would be very interesting. If you're seeing patterns in perhaps more recent artists or other artists that we haven't covered so much in this class, you can use assignment 2 as an opportunity to explore that for yourself. So all of the readings for this week talk about authenticity in hip-hop. So as you've seen, there are various ways that you can talk about this, and we'll get into that very shortly. But first, I just wanted to talk about the sociology of authenticity more broadly, and especially kind of the main contributions that Richard Peterson made towards this line of research in sociology. All of these articles refer to Richard Peterson and other scholars who have contributed to the sociology of authenticity. So if that wasn't quite clear, I can give you some background on that now. So the study of authenticity is an approach to understanding cultural industries. So when we're talking about cultural forms, we're talking about authenticity is something that's valued, and this isn't just something that happens in hip hop, right? Authenticity is important for all types of music. And beyond, when you're thinking about like art worlds, even, culinary, cultural industries have this like authentic form of different culinary, types, like Italian food. There's like authentic Italian food, authentic Indian food, and debates about this, right? It's not an inherent thing that you know it exactly when you see it, although sometimes that's true. So In looking to the cultural industries, Richard Peterson called authenticity the renewable resource of these cultural industries. So he was looking at country music. So what's the ideal of a country musician or a country music artist? Somebody from a lower socioeconomic background, a rural area. There's a handful of musical instruments and kind of storytelling tropes that are typically associated with these people's backgrounds. But then again, this shifts over time. So when he's calling it a renewable resource, he's saying that even though there might be this ideal of country music artist, when we might think of like Hank Williams or Willie Nelson or somebody like that, right? But that's not static. Eventually, people are going to get tired of that, and they're going to want something new, and then there will be a new form of authenticity. Maybe somebody who comes and challenges the status quo. One example of this, which you might want to explore in the assignment, kind of building off of the first assignment and gender. We can talk about hip-hop today. Authentic hip-hop identities are a bit softer than they used to be, right? Like there used to be this very kind of aggressive, masculine kind of stereotype of the hip-hop artist, which still exists. But when we think of artists like Drake, who include a bit more emotional complexity in their raps, we can talk about perhaps there's a new form of authenticity in hip-hop that's becoming valued. Another thing about authenticity is that being able to kind of identify what is authentic or not, or to fit that those categories of authenticity, to fit within them. These also maintain socio-cultural boundaries. So by that I mean there are cultural boundaries. There are various cultural forms which fit better together. You can say that comic books and novels, those are kind of like literary novels. Those are kind of opposite sides of the spectrum. Whereas Chicago blues and New York blues or something. These kind of perhaps fit within similar cultural boundaries more so than the like comic books and literary novels. But then at the same time, there's social boundaries. So these have to do with, say, the difference between you can even just, like, an innocent example might be like majors at a university. These are social boundaries. It's easier to kind of engage with people who are in your same major, or you happen to see them more often, and maybe cliques start to form within those as well. And so those are kind of like those social boundaries. Considering both aspects of those helps you to see how authenticity exists in everyday life. So the Harkness reading is really going to get into this. We'll get into that a bit more. But it is really worth noting these components of authenticity, where it comes from in sociology. It's about cultural industries, and it's about cultural consumption. And in the way that cultural industries kind of produce culture, and in the ways that we consume culture, this is related to the ways that social boundaries are maintained. Okay, now that we've covered the background of taking a sociological approach to studying hip-hop, let's get into the readings for this week. So the McLeod reading, I think, serves as a good kind of transition away from the content analysis studies that we read last week, and into new social research methods that we're going to be exploring throughout the rest of the semester. So throughout his study, he's looking at the discursive context of authenticity in hip-hop. Again, he's using this content analysis method. He has this pretty funky data set, which is including things that critics wrote, lyrics, a bunch of other things, and then he also did interviews with prominent hip-hop artists. And what he was looking at was the discursive context of authenticity. So anytime authenticity like it was exhibited, somebody was talking about it, someone was claiming it, someone was saying somebody else was like not authentic or whatever, right? He identified all of those and tried to come up with some sort of typology of like what's going on there. So yeah, like I said, he finds 800 instances of this in his content analysis data set, and he also conducted 23 interviews. And he identifies the semantic dimensions of authenticity. So what does that mean? Semantics, like semantic analysis, is a kind of offshoot of linguistics. So it's basically trying to unpack the meaning of a word, in this case authenticity, within the hip-hop community. So in his analysis, he finds 6 dimensions of authenticity. He calls these, what I've kind of turned into shorthand here. There's identity, that's being true to yourself. Being black is associated with being authentic in hip-hop. Being underground, as opposed to, say, commercial. Being hard, as opposed to soft, and we know that these are coded as masculine and feminine often. Being street as opposed to suburbs, or rural areas, urban as opposed to rural, and old school as opposed to newer forms of hip-hop. So knowing the kind of classic foundations of hip-hop and drawing a connection there is important for authenticity in hip-hop. So I think it's worth noting the context of this study, which relates to the hip-hop wars that we were talking about in week 2. Okay, so I think it's worth reminding ourselves of the context of this study. So McLeod was talking to hip-hop artists and collecting data, when the hip-hop wars that we covered in week 2 were in full swing. So, think back to the example of that one hip-hop artist who was especially financially successful being like, I don't want to do another interview with somebody asking me, like, what does keeping it real mean to you? He's like, I'm sick of this question. But that also shows that there's something really important going on here. Which he identifies as when hip-hop gains mainstream credibility and not only not only the right to kind of exist in mainstream culture or to be a subject of mainstream culture, but to be a fixture in this kind of like popular culture context. When that happens, older versions of hip-hop don't seem to exist as credibly there. They seem to be, faked, made for profit, right? So he's saying when a cultural form becomes that big, there's this authentic core of what makes the culture that becomes threatened. And so people need to start defending it. So I think that that's really worth noting. And I think that it's worth, noting the complexities of what was going on in the 1990s when people were having these discussions. Who was getting, whose claims to authenticity were being taken seriously, and who was forced to defend their claims to authenticity. So the example of the guy who was constantly grumpy about being interviewed by McLeod is a good example. But I think the example of Will Smith that McLeod brings up a couple times throughout the article is really relevant. And so I'm just going to throw over to a clip I saw recently, which I feel like encapsulates the point that he's trying to make.
There's my daughter. Would you like to meet her?
Oh gosh, sir, there's a big question mark on that one. I seem to be painfully shy with the fairer sex.
Oh, nonsense.
Oh, hi, Daddy.
Photos. There is someone I'd like you to meet. Mimi, Kip Smithers, varsity crew from Bel Air. Gentleman and a scholar and soon to be a fine surgeon.
You flatter me, sir.
I'll just leave the two of you alone. Mimi.
Look, before you get yourself all worked up into a lather, I just would like to say this. I am sick of you whitewashed, preppy stuffed shirts.
What?
Look, I don't need some stooge who's going to play it to my father. I want a real man, someone dangerous, someone exciting, someone from the streets.
Prince is in effect, baby. I'm not down with this preppy nonsense. Carlton told me to do this. Yo, baby, I'm definitely straight out the hood.
That was the worst homeboy act I've ever heard.
But it's not an act, it's the real deal, baby. Hey, yo, see.
Alright, so in that example from Fresh Prince, you'll see that authenticity was at the foundation of that scene, right? The questions of authenticity, which side that of himself that he's presenting is authentic, if any, right? And I think that that's kind of the claims that people are generally making when they're talking about authenticity, and that's and in that same sense, a claim to authenticity is only as good as somebody who accepts it, whereas in the case of that example, his supposedly authentic from the hood sort of persona wasn't seen as authentic. So in the same way that Will Smith's claims of being an authentic representative of hip-hop culture can be put into question, this represents that anybody's claims of being, an authentic member of hip-hop culture can be put into question, whether or not you're a black man or from, a disadvantaged neighborhood. And I think that recognizing this sort of flexibility of authenticity and how it needs to not only be claimed but authenticated by others leads us to be able to explain the existence of not only white people in hip-hop communities, but the existence of white hip-hop stars. I've talked to a few students who have had questions like this, and you might be one of them, but when we're talking about hip-hop authenticity and hip-hop history, how can we explain the success and the ability of white people to be well regarded in hip-hop culture, people like Eminem or Rick Rubin? The next readings that we're going to get into are going to help us to kind of unpack this, but I hope that this can help to give you kind of this paper especially can help you to conceptualize what is authenticity in hip-hop, on its own terms. And then the next two readings will kind of show you how, even though we can say that there are kind of these strict codes of authenticity in hip-hop, there is still a lot of flexibility in whether or not your claims are going to be accepted at any particular moment. And so that's what we'll get into now. Alright, so in contrast to McLeod's article, the next two articles that we're going to cover help us to understand not how this culture that's facing assimilation tries to maintain its identity, but how those who are trying to assimilate into that culture also maintain its identity. So this paper also connects with the semantic dimension of hip-hop in terms of the old school versus new distinction, but actually this article does go a bit further and nuances that a little bit more. Instead of just being new versus old, he says there's a difference between the present, the future, and the past, and the affordances that those give different people to claim an authentic kind of role in the hip-hop community. Another thing before we really get into the study that I'd like to note is that this study draws on Bourdieu and field theory, especially the stuff on cultural production. So in this class, we're not going to be getting into the complexities of field theory. I could just give you a quick recap that Bourdieu, he distinguishes between economic capital, cultural capital, social capital, and symbolic capital. So quickly, just in case you're not super familiar with this or are a bit rusty, economic capital, that's money. Cultural capital, that's skills. And it could be education, but for in this class, you can think of the ability to rap, the ability to understand how to do DJing with two turntables. That's the cultural capital that's valuable in hip-hop culture. Social capital, those are your social connections, and symbolic capital, that's prestige. So in the way that like Drake has a lot of symbolic capital right now, whereas R. Kelly does not have a lot of symbolic capital right now. So we can think about that. So yes, I just wanted to kind of mention that, but if you don't get all of the nuances of the kind of Borgesian arguments that Gibson's advancing here, that's okay. What we really want to focus on is how he's talking about authenticity and what he's able to explain by analyzing how people frame their participation in hip-hop communities. So, in the way that McLeod's article, shows us that racial and spatial things are important for authenticity, he does say, old school versus new school distinctions, but Gibson really does focus on the temporal aspects of claiming authenticity, and by this he means the styles of authenticity work. So in the paper, he conducted 3 months of field work and interviews. So we can talk about the methods a little bit more, or we'll be going through methods a little bit more in the future. But in this one, it consisted of, going to studios, hanging out with hip-hop artists and producers, and doing interviews with them. So what does claiming authenticity by using temporality mean, and what does it allow people to do? So in this sense, he helps us to see that one of the ways in for white people to participate in hip-hop culture is to emphasize their adherence to classic hip-hop conventions. So the conventions that were established in like old school hip-hop, right? So they can emphasize this time in hip-hop and an appreciation for that, which helps them to downplay their racial background as white people and also their kind of social position in the suburbs. On the other hand, he found that because inner city artists, hip-hop artists who were black, they didn't have to kind of negotiate those dimensions, the racial and the spatial dimensions of authenticity. So they didn't need to claim some sort of adherence to this classic idealized form. They were more grounded in claiming a contemporary form of authenticity. So what's the importance of hip-hop in social life today? And then in the other sense, he showed how people who are claiming authenticity by using claims about hip-hop futures, they were able to kind of get around that issue too. So in that way, they were genre bending. They called this, the next level type shit, or not just like what's the coolest stuff right now, but what's going to be the coolest stuff in 5 years. So he argued that, in the way that we were seeing generally white people were claiming this like classic means of authenticity. Generally, black people from the cities were claiming this contemporary form of authenticity, whereas this futuristic authenticity work blended from those two different racial groups and, people who were in the city versus the suburbs. So he said it was, like I just mentioned, it's racially heterogeneous. And it's this conscious maintenance of the image of unconventionality. So in that sense, it's like the authenticity is this work that people do to seem futuristic in the present. And he does make a really important point that even though they're being like, okay, we're very futuristic in terms of like how we're talking about hip-hop music and how we produce it and the music that we do produce, it still does rely on those normative forms of distribution and promotion. So all three of these forms of identity work are kind of based on conventional aspects of the cultural industries in general, just in the way that people make things, send them out into the world, and then the way that people consume them. All right, so moving on to the final reading for today. The Gibson article, he takes a kind of big picture perspective to look at, like, what are all of the authenticity claims that are going on here in the place where he did fieldwork. Whereas Harkness, he asks, what are the authenticity claims that outsiders are making in this scene? So this is a pretty impressive study. He did 6 years of ethnographic fieldwork in Chicago. And I think it's worth noting, in this paper, he talks about the relevance of Latino identities for hip-hop in Chicago. We haven't explored the relevance of Latino and Latina MCs in hip-hop culture in the history section of this class. But if you would like to kind of explore that more, that's definitely an option for you in exploring how, say, Latino men and or Latina women in hip-hop claim authenticity. In this paper, he makes a lot of connections to Grazian's study of blues. So I mentioned Grazian earlier on when we were talking about kind of the historical legacy of sociological studies of authenticity. In the way that Grazian found something pretty similar that Harkness finds and then builds on. So Grazian was looking at blues clubs in Chicago, and the ideal type of blues artist is a black man playing, guitar and singing about hardships, right? And so he found that there was this kind of scale of authenticity where black blues artists were more authentic than white blues artists, but a white blues artist who grew up in a certain neighborhood in Chicago was more authentic than a white artist who grew up in, say, the suburbs, or not even Chicago. Maybe they moved there from New York or something, right? So there's this kind of sliding scale of authenticity in these communities, and he does use that to explain how club owners manage the bands. There's kind of the more authentic blues clubs had developed that reputation by largely having black blues artists play there in Chicago. Is one of the things that he finds. So these are the fixed markers of authenticity, right? Where did you grow up? What's your racial background? Etc. What's your gender? So these are these kind of what he calls these fixed markers of identity, but Harkness is saying that fixed markers of authenticity are only so important, and then there's a sort of fluidity in terms of who gets to make the strongest, or whose authenticity claim is taken the most seriously, or is the strongest in any given situation. So in the way that we've seen that authentic hip-hop is generally seen as a black cultural art form, predominantly where it's a predominant space that's held by men, and kind of hegemonic masculinity kind of resides there and is very prominent in the cultural forms, etc., etc. But he's kind of saying well, imagine that you go to a hip-hop club on a women MC night. In that case, claims to being authentic are situational, and they can actually be reversed, where it's the men who are also MCs have less of a kind of claim to authenticity that night. And yeah, so he talks about that on page 288, if you'd like to take a look. I think that's a pretty nice passage there where he goes through that. So, relating back to what I was saying earlier, which is tough to kind of grapple with, but it really does kind of show you the complexities of social life, which is that the socio-cultural boundaries that are associated with understandings of authenticity are both rigid and malleable, right? We have this ideal of a hip-hop artist, or a country music artist, or an Italian chef, whatever, right? We have these ideals which are actually really rigid. Those are stereotypes that are difficult to change. But at the same time, in situations as people, these are actually a little bit more malleable than people often are like just kind of taking that stereotype, the rigidity of the stereotype for granted. These sociocultural boundaries are actually more malleable than they seem if you also consider how these stereotypes shape our interactions and social life. So I guess I can close off this section by just kind of summarizing how Harkness says that these outsiders do this, that they're able to play up the malleable side of the sociocultural boundaries that are associated with authenticity and play down the more rigid ones, right? So in contrast to race and gender, which are often, like, they're a bit more rigid in the sense that when people can make assumptions more quickly, right? And I believe he uses that example of the Latino MC who is really light-skinned, so the people assume that he's white right away. So in that sort of sense, he doesn't fit within that rigid category, but he can say, oh yeah, well, I'm just light-skinned, but I'm actually Latino, and then they're like, oh, well, I totally understand, blah, blah, blah. You know, he can do it that way, but that's he's kind of just telling somebody that they misread this marker, which people often can assume very quickly, and that shape social interactions in important ways. So what Harkness is saying is that people who are outsiders in the hip-hop community, people from the suburbs, white folks, women, they play down these fixed markers of authenticity and play up the interpretive categories. So he uses the example of class in the article, and we can think about that as like, it's easier to kind of fake your class background than it is to fake your race. Right? Obviously, it's not totally possible in every sort of situation, but he says that you can kind of emphasize certain interpretive categories. Another one that's important, right, is skill. So if you're just an excellent hip-hop artist and you know, have really clever rhymes that nobody's heard before, and you deliver them in an entertaining way, you know, that does meet an interpretive kind of category of skill that people have to kind of figure out. They can't see it immediately. And so when you don't have fixed markers of authenticity, you have to play up these more performative expressions of authenticity. Yeah, so that's Harkness's research. I think it's worth considering for yourself as you kind of make your notes here. Think about the different methods that these researchers employed and what it allowed them to see. So McLeod focused on content analysis and interviews, but what were you able to learn, or what do you think these Gibson and Harkness were able to access by going to these actual places where people are doing hip-hop rapping and DJing and stuff, by actually going there and taking notes? Is there something that's extremely valuable there, or do you think that we could have gotten these same sort of insights without actually having to go and conduct 6 years of field work? Okay, so to wrap up today's lecture, we talked a lot about authenticity, and I'd encourage you to think about which dimensions of authenticity would you like to explore, what kind of hip-hop artists would you like to study to kind of learn how do they claim authenticity within this community. And then, yeah, as we go further, we're going to be covering various social research methods. In today's class, we covered content analysis, interviews, ethnography. In future weeks, we will cover more case study approaches to hip-hop. The Nicki Minaj article does a good job of that. And we will cover a musicological analysis. So that's a big word just to say we're analyzing the aspects of the music itself. So you could say, like, how aggressive does it sound? How heavy is the beat? You know, does it rely on, yeah, just like beats, or is it more musical? Is there like a piano line or something like that? We'll get into that more next week in Lena's article, and we will continue to see ethnographic participatory methods next week, as well as issues that have come up as social researchers have studied hip-hop, and how we can address that in the future. All right, and so that's it for this week. I wish you the best in completing assignment 1. Again, that's due this Friday at noon. Yeah, and take care.